I think pretty much everyone that's ever listened to the album Dark Side of the Moon recognizes that it is a profoundly influential album. Not just because of the numbers of sales and the money that it's made and the impact that it's had on so many people's lives, but also the very, very specific feeling that something wonderful is contained within this album. It is, in my opinion, the greatest album ever made. And in this episode, I want to really pull at this album. I'm going to pull at the strings of this album, and I'm going to try and figure out, did Syd Barrett Dark Side of the Moon? Now, if you're new to this, basically what I do, or what I'm doing with this series, is I'm going through and I'm tracking the three possible influences of Mr. Barrett to other albums and other artists. One would just be that he's a general influence in some way. Two would be perhaps that there's some form of interaction that's going on. And third would be perhaps that there's some kind of direct writing that's going on. And of course, a person like Mr. Barrett is motivated, or could be noted, I guess you could say, most specifically through his thoughts and ideas. He seems to have been a person of thoughts and ideas. So I would like to really tear apart this album, and I'm going to do this in a group of episodes. I'm not going to do it all in one episode because this is just way too big, and it's taken me forever really to figure out how I want to present this material because it's so complex. So what I'm going to do in this very first episode, I'm just going to run through a couple of videos, and then I'm going to do a Syd score for the whole album. And then I'm going to ask a few questions. Now, I'll probably have either 2 more episodes or 3 more. I still haven't really decided. We'll just see how it kind of goes. But the second episode is going to be a discussion of context and perhaps influences on the lyrics and imagery of this album. The third is going to be a very specific discussion on the dark side of Oz. And this has been done by many, many people. And I don't think that most of them have done it properly, I will say. I was not going to discuss Dark Side of Oz, but I realized as I went and looked at it again just recently that a lot of people are missing a lot of connections. And that's very easy to do because most people are not very, I guess you could say, knowledgeable on Mr. Barrett, and they're not very knowledgeable on the entirety of his work. And so they're not picking up on how to look at the Wizard of Oz through his eyes. In other words, they're seeing connections as they see them, not necessarily how Mr. Barrett would have seen them. And that will become apparent when I put together that third episode. And then in the last episode, I think I'll do a discussion on Dune, because Dune is coming out soon. They're remaking what is, in my opinion, the best science fiction novel ever written. And they're tying in music from this album, Dark Side of the Moon. And I think that's a wonderful combination. I'm actually a little bit worried that they might not do it enough. So normally I would really be against the idea of commercializing the medium. But I will say that this album, if you're going to pick a story that it would fit mostly well, not entirely, and I'll get into that I'll get into the reasons and whys and wherefores to that in that episode. But basically, this album is very close to the narrative and theme and plot of Dune. So I think it's a wonderful fit, and it certainly does add a feel to that movie that is very original, and I hope they use all the music for that movie. So here's what I'd like to do to start off. All right, what I'd like to do to start off is I'm going to suggest 3 things for you to watch. The first is an interview that is a Pink Floyd 2003 documentary on the making of Dark Side of the Moon, and I'll give the information here. I'll also link it. The second is an Alan Parsons discussion on the story of Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon. Now, Alan Parsons, of course, is an individual that helped produce that album. And he also had previously been working with the Beatles. And as we have mentioned in our Peeling Syd Barrett episode and in our discussion of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Pink Floyd was, of course, working at Abbey Road at the same time that the Beatles were putting together Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So if you would, check out both of those, and I'll suggest that you watch them all the way through. And then once you're done, I guess go ahead and come back, and I will discuss some notes and questions that I have, and you can see if they kind of line up with what some of your thoughts are. And then we'll go ahead and do a breakdown of the songs, and I'll ask a few questions to end, and that'll be pretty much it. So check them out, and I'll see you back here pretty soon. All right, hopefully you had a chance to check those out. So what I would like to do then is run through my notes for each of them and some thoughts, and we'll see kind of how things line up with what you, in general, I guess, think of things. So, and this won't involve a discussion on the songs and the music just yet, just on their discussions on the making of the album. So for the first one, I'm just going to discuss the Pink Floyd 2003 documentary. And the first thing I'll talk about is about 3 minutes in, Mr. Waters is discussing the development of 3 or 4 songs. He discusses Eclipse kind of being an idea, and he discusses quite a bit the effects and the way that the music kind of was sequenced and put together. And I guess that's pretty much it for that part. Now, about 5.5 minutes in, he stresses or he discusses the stress of travel and touring and how that kind of inspired him to write the lyrics. Pretty much everyone is in agreement that Mr. Roger Waters wrote these lyrics. There's nobody else discussing the lyrics. And I would like to point out to you that throughout the entirety of this discussion, there is no discussion on the methodology of the writing of the lyrics. In other words, what is the inspiration? How did it happen? How were they written? Etc. The only person who would know is Roger Waters, and apparently he did this absent of everyone else in the group. There is also a mention of Cycles of Fear of Flying, and of course Mr. Gilmour touches on this with his first album and his song Learning to Fly, which at the time I did not like that album, but a momentary lapse of reason, but now I actually enjoy that album quite a bit. I think it's a very good album. About 6 minutes in, Rick Wright mentions that 18 hours a day the band was at it, and so then you have to kind of wonder, if we are able to identify deeper things, who is generating those deeper things? In other words, if the band is so busy, and they were busy, here's kind of a discussion of the albums that they put out. Piper at the Gates of Dawn in 67, Saucer Full of Secrets in 68, the More album in 69, Amagama in 69, Atom Heart Mother in 1970, Metal in 1971, Obscured by Clouds 1972, Dark Side of the Moon in 1973. That is more than an album a year. And of course, they were extensively touring. So if there are really deep ideas that are kind of tied up in these, specifically in the lyrics, then you would have to say that they were already there in Mr. Waters, or perhaps that something else is going on. Now at about 6.5 minutes in, Mr. Gilmour says that this is kind of the coming of age lyrically moment for Roger Waters, and of course that's his interpretation, and definitely you get the feeling that he recognizes that the lyrics of this are quite extraordinary. At about 9 minutes in, Mr. Rick Wright discusses the song Great Gig in the Sky. Now that title is a very interesting title, of course, because as we have previously discussed, there is alliteration in this title, and that alliteration is beyond the great gig, the G sound. It also includes the K sound in sky, because K and G are very similar in the mouth. So great gig in the sky is a form of phonetic alliteration. So who came up with that? That's pretty pronouncedly interesting, I guess you could say. There's a discussion that Clare Torrey came in and did her song. Her singing portion, which is, I think, what everyone would agree if you were to consider one thing that really stands out on this album. It is Clare Torrey singing on the song Great Gig in the Sky. And there's some backstory to it that is fairly significant. But let's just say for now that it's pretty much regarded by most folks to be an extraordinary thing. And you can take that to be a happenstance and luck, and perhaps just a bit of synchronicity, or an amazing coincidence, or you can think that there's maybe something else that's going on. We'll talk a little bit more about Clare Torrey here in a bit. Now, about 10.5 minutes in, they discuss money and the development of it and the sound. In other words, how that the clinking noise of coins and the register sound was all wound, and they spent a lot of time talking about how they put that very specific thing together. My question is, of course, if they have that much information on that specific sound, why isn't there a discussion on the lyrics? How were the lyrics put together? What was the idea for the song? How did it come about? Perhaps that's all just secondary, of course. And the most amazing thing about the song is this lead-in of tape that's cut and then replayed repeatedly. But I have to say, personally, it's an interesting sound effect, I guess you could say. But really, is it any more interesting than the bass line? The bass line leading into the song Money is a very cool bass line. So why don't they discuss, coming up with that bass line? I don't know. I don't totally get it. It's just, I guess you could say it's kind of a random question. Now, at about 12.5 minutes, Mr. Waters specifically ties the lyrics of Have a Cigar to an occurrence. And that's interesting, of course, because he's discussing the story of the lyrics of Have a Cigar. And of course, that song isn't until later. That's not even on this album. So how is it that he has these specific recollections of Have a Cigar, which is yet to come, but he's not giving very much information about the lyrics that go into this album? And of course, the lyrics on this album are extraordinary. So where is the discussion about the lyrics on this album? About 15 minutes in, Mr. Waters mentions that he hasn't really listened to the whole album in about 15-20 years. That's a little bit odd to me. I mean, if I made an album like this, I would listen to it more than every 20 years. It's an extraordinary album. I would be very proud of this as a musician and as a writer. So I'm a little bit confused. Why is it that Mr. Waters doesn't really seem to be showing the kind of pride in a creation that at least I would expect if I was the one making it? About 16.5 minutes in, Storm Thurgeson mentions how they put together the actual geometric design of the triangle and the light passing through it. And this, of course, reminds me very much of something else, and I'll kind of give you a hint right here. Now, there is a statement that one specifically inspired people, particularly. There were apparently numerous designs, and of course, if you know the history of Storm Thurgeson, you know that he also was at 101 and had been a friend with numerous people. same as Mick Rock. So there's a very kind of a loose affiliation that connects all these individuals together, and quite a few of them had spent some time at 101 Cromwell Road. 17 minutes in, there's a tied in with lyrics. Mr. Storm Thurgeson mentions that the idea of the pyramid was tied in generally with the feel of the lyrics that he was shown by Mr. Roger Waters, and he mentions that a triangle kind of represents indifference and madness and greed. And of course, he also mentions there that about 19 minutes in that there are religious overtones to this music. And of course, we've mentioned the many religious overtones in Mr. Barrett's music. So we have to kind of wonder, exactly how that kind of design came about. The pyramid, of course, or the triangle is very similar to a pyramid, and a pyramid, of course, is tied to Egypt, at least in the minds of many people in the old world, not necessarily with South America and Central America as it is in the Americas, but generally speaking, a pyramid is tied to the ideas of Egypt in the old world. And of course, we've gone through and discussed many of the Egyptian references in earlier Pink Floyd and earlier Syd Barrett songs. So here again is a pyramid. Now, that's pretty much it for the actual discussion of that video. Let's go ahead then, and I guess we'll move on to the Alan Parsons discussion. And he mentions early on that as an 18-year-old, he got to start with the Beatles. And about 3 minutes in, he notes that he specifically suggested Clare to sing on The Great Gig in the Sky. And there is the kind of tie that you would expect to see from someone who actually has a hand in something that's being made, a very specific recollection of a specific instance. He discusses how she was singing and then says, no, they didn't want words, they just want sounds. And he says, basically, the guy said that he didn't want that, he just wanted wailing, almost like a banshee. We've discussed the banshee and the white lady references before in previous episodes of Peeling Syd Barrett. But here, you have to ask, who is the guy? The guy said, the guy says. Of course, he could be saying the guys said, but it kind of sounds like he says the guy. So who's the guy? I don't know. About 6.5 minutes in, he mentions the clocks. So the clocks that are the beginning of the song time. He specifically discusses that he had already put together that sound effect and asked if he could use it. I guess he had given up the copyright to it, I don't know. And that it was used and recorded as part of the song time. Now, he also mentions that the songs initially, as they were developed, didn't have names. They were just kind of sections. And that eventually titles for them were made a little bit later on. So that's pretty much it. I mean, that's the basic kind of background ideas, I guess you could say, that go into the making of the album. So what I'd like to do now then is let's go ahead and start our discussion on the actual album itself. So the first thing I would like to discuss is the intro, of course, to the album, which starts with a heartbeat. And this is important, of course, because the album ends with a heartbeat. And if you just want to say that's a heartbeat coming in and a heartbeat going out for artistic effect, that definitely makes some sense to me. But I also will point out that if you wanted to loop, it's a way to loop something, that you have a starting and an ending point that coincide so you can come back to it and keep going, if you wanted to make a loop. So let's go ahead then and look at the lyrics to this. Now, the first song, of course, is Breathe. And let's, if you would, I guess, pull up the lyrics on your phone. There's a statement to breathe or breathe in the air. So that right there, to me, is already one point. And the reason for that is, of course, that we know that Mr. Barrett was into yoga. And one of the first things that you learn when you start some type of exercise, I guess you could say, is that you have to concentrate on your breathing. So you want to get your breathing down. It's the first thing you learn in yoga. And it could just be a coincidence, but that is interesting to me that they're starting with the idea of breath. And so I'll give a point for that. The next line is that a person shouldn't be afraid to care. I'll give a point for that. Why wouldn't someone be afraid to care? Of course, the reason someone shouldn't be afraid to care is because they've been hurt or something else in the past. If someone is not knowledgeable of pain, they already are not afraid to care. They care about everything. It's only when someone has experienced loss that they become afraid to care. And there are a lot of talks by the band about how good things were going around this time, all the way through Wish You Were Here, and that eventually things were going so good, in fact, that they were having trouble coming up with material. So why and who is having a hard time and having trouble caring about people? I have no idea. But I do know that Mr. Barrett would have a reason to be afraid to care, and we've discussed that in our Peeling Syd Barrett series. The next line is, you can leave, but don't leave me. Now that a fear of loss and the idea of someone being able to be free, but also not leaving someone, of course, can tie in very easily with numerous Syd Barrett songs, which involve the idea perhaps of someone being married and going about their own life, but not totally leaving me as a person. In other words, you can have your freedom and you can choose your own ground, but don't actually leave me. Don't leave me totally out of your life. That form of freedom is something that's often expressed in Mr. Barrett's songs. I'll give that another point. The next line is, look around, and then choosing your own ground. And of course, around ground is alliteration that Mr. Barrett has used before. That was in Astronomy Domine. That's 4 points. The next line is mention of living long, and then high you fly. There's a mention of flying, which is consistently mentioned in Mr. Barrett's music. And of course, that type of flight is not always a reference to actual physical flight on a plane or something along those lines. There's mention of smiles given and tears that are cried. Tears that are cried are often mentioned in Mr. Barrett's songs. That's another point. Now, I'll just remind you that Roger Waters wrote these lyrics. So Roger Waters is crying tears. Roger Waters is afraid of people leaving him. Roger Waters is afraid to care about people. I mean, just consider that. Is that something that makes sense to you? Is he the type of person, based on his history and his actions, that would be someone who is crying and is afraid of people leaving him and is asking someone not to leave him, etc.? Anyway, if you want to believe that, you can. I'll leave that up to you. I mentioned that everything that you touch and everything you see is everything that's going to be in your life. It's a very philosophical statement. I would say that it's a form of religious statement. I don't know. I guess you could say that's another point, but I'll just leave that one alone. So next line is about a rabbit, run rabbit. So that could very well be a Alice in Wonderland kind of an idea. Of course, the rabbit's always late, and and he goes down a hole, so there's a reference there, dig that hole, forget the sun. That is a literature reference. I will give that a point, so we're at 7. Forget the sun, in other words, go away from the sun and go down into the earth. And the next line is, when at last the work is done. So of course here there is a mention of doing work, in other words, living a very mundane life that is away from the sun, away from greater things, away from freedom, the light, the wonder of life. And then there's a statement that you can't sit down because it's time to dig another one. In other words, you can't ever stop digging holes, doing the work that are actually holes that are leading you away from the sun into the shade of the earth. That concern with the constant need to do work and the idea that you're leaving behind something higher that's more beautiful is consistent with Mr. Barrett. I'll give that another point. That's an 8 point now. And the next line just pretty much repeats. I'll just add in the last bit. It says, long you live and fly. I won't give another point for that because it's a repeat. There's a mention of riding the tide. And of course, riding the tides and being balanced on waves is something that was just covered in Metal, in particular Echoes. And depending upon whether or not you think Mr. Barrett influenced that or had a direct hand in that or wrote it, you can give it that. But because it's not directly attributed to him, of course Mr. Barrett does mention water quite a bit, so I guess I'll give it a point for that. So I'm at 9. And then the mention of racing towards an early grave. Now there are quite a few mentions of living long and racing towards an early grave, etc. So there's concerns about life and death here, and that is consistent with some of Mr. Barrett's music, so I'll give that one last point, in particular a song like Opal. So that's pretty much it for Breathe. I give that 10 points, which to me is a very large amount because this song is a very short song. The next song that I'll discuss is the song Time. This is a little bit of a longer song. Now I won't be discussing everything that's tied in with the musicality of the album. I'll just be discussing largely the lyrics. Okay, so here we go. Time. Now the beginning of this song starts with a whole bunch of clocks that are kind of clocks that are sounding, bells that are ringing, and alarms, I guess you could say, that are ringing. I just want to point out that that also happened before, and that happened at the end of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn album. And so if you are of the mindset that perhaps Mr. Barrett might be using those sounds to announce departure and then reappearing, or perhaps re-influencing, or re-entry, perhaps, that would be something that you could point to there. At any rate, let's go ahead then and start to tear apart this idea. And there are many songs with Mr. Barrett referencing clocks, and like a clock that was sent through a washing machine, of course, and he often references time and clocks. So, of course, he may have been using something like that if he was so inclined to be a form of almost like a signature. So let's look at the lyrics here. There's mention that someone is ticking away and moments and they make up a dull day. So that has tinges to it of the song Dominoes. And the song Dominoes, written by Mr. Barrett, previously specifically mentions spending time, wasting time playing dominoes. This has very much a similar feel to it. Though it's worded totally different, I can't give any points for it here. I don't see too much alliteration there either, so I'm just going to let that go. Again, frittering and wasting hours in an offhand way. Now, I have seen an interview with Mr. Barrett where he specifically uses this term offhand. And I believe at that point he was being interviewed about why things fell apart with the band. And he said, I don't know. He said something along the lines of, I don't know, perhaps it's just being a bit offhanded about things or something like that. But that very specific word choice is one that Mr. Barrett does use in an interview, and I will include that information here if I can find it. The next bit is, but I can't really call that out specifically here right now, so I won't give a point. If I can locate it, I'll add it in later. A statement in the next line, the third line, kicking around on a piece of ground. Okay, in a hometown. So there again is around and ground and hometown. So I will give one more point for alliteration. And just as an aside here now, I do want to mention that Dominique kind of mentioned in a comment that I have previously called this clanging, and I just want to point out that yes, this is alliteration, poetic alliteration, and it's very difficult to know the difference between clanging and alliteration because one has a certain judgment tied to it, and the other one is alliteration, of course, is specifically tied to being poetic. So if I could change one thing about all the work that I've done regarding this, I would have never started using the term clanging. That was something that I had read somewhere, I don't know where. And although it is, I guess, in some ways appropriate for some people to call that out, especially if they believe that the influences of Mr. Barrett or Mr. Barrett himself were clanging, then I guess that's why they chose to use that. But that has a very specific connotation to it, and I don't believe now that I should have ever used that term. At any rate, let's keep going. The question I have for this third line then is, who is kicking around in their hometown? At this point in time, there's only one person really doing that, and that's Mr. Barrett. So I'll give a point for that. I don't really understand, why is Mr. Waters talking about kicking around in his home ground? He's not even in Cambridge. He's been staying in London, mostly, to my knowledge, anyway. And waiting around for someone or something. And they're going to show you the way. Now, the way, there are many, many words and many, many songs that Mr. Barrett has when he specifically says the way. She's only paving her way. Ectochrome plane, you see the flies. So, or I see the flies. So this idea of the way is used quite often by Mr. Barrett, and it's quite obtuse, so it's hard to know exactly what's being referenced. I'll give a point for that, so I have 3. The next line mentions being tired of lying in the sunshine. So this person is staying home and watching the rain. Well, who's staying home and watching the rain? There are many references to Mr. Barrett, by Mr. Barrett, of staying home and watching the rain. So I'll give a point for that. Now, I forgot something. I just want to point out in the very first line, make up a dull day. Now, sometimes when I hear that, I hear dog day. And a dog day, of course, would be something important because of the reference to the dog days of summer in the album More. And perhaps this is make up a dog day. So taking away the moments to make up a dog day. So why is it a dog day? Well, a dog day would be a summer day. And of course, there's mention of being tired of laying in the sunshine. So it could be a summer reference. I do think it's more likely that it's a dull day, but if it is a dog day there, I just want to point out that that would be another kind of something that would make you wonder and would tie back into the More album. So there is mention that they're young and there's time to kill. And then they find that 10 years have got behind you. So I'm going to give a point now to Mr. Barrett. Or I'm going to give a point, so we're at 5 points, and I'll explain why. Okay, so one of the influences that's noted by Mr. Chapman in A Very Irregular Head is John Clare, specifically pages 354 and through 359. He gives quite a discussion on the similarities between Mr. Syd Barrett and John Clare, the poet. And I would like to call something out, or call something to your attention now, if I can find it. Here we go. So we just did this line, and then one day, 10 years got behind you. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, there is because of the note of correspondences and similarities in lifestyle by Mr. Chapman, I actually went through Mr. Clare's poetry. Mr. Clare has a poem called Address to a Lark, or Address to a Lark. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th verse. Now 20 years I've packed behind me. Okay, so what is our lyric here? 10 years have got behind you. Isn't that interesting? Very strong correlation to Mr. Clare's poetry. So if they're at it 18 hours a day or 16 hours a day or whatever Mr. Rick Wright was, who is going through and reading John Clare's poetry and taking sections of John Clare's poetry and adding it to this song? Because that appears to be what's happening. I will give you one more example of that in just a moment. So 10 years got behind you. No one told you when to run, and you missed the starting gun. Okay, so there's, I guess, a starting gun because there's a race to be run. And so you run, but you want to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking. Okay, that right there is tied to another John Clare poem. What is life? The very first two lines. And what is life? An hourglass on the run, a mist retreating from the morning sun, a busy, bustling, still repeated dream. Who has gone through John Clare's poetry and is cutting it up and putting it into this song? That appears to be what is happening. So I'm going to give another point there. I'm going to do a further breakdown of Mr. John Clare's poetry in our context episode, and that'll be our next episode that I'll do for this specific breakdown of Did Syd Barrett, Dark Side of the Moon. There's mention in the next line that the sun is racing around to come up behind you again. And it's the same in a relative way, but you're older and closer to death. The next line says that every year is getting shorter, and that people, or perhaps this person, the author, can't seem to find the time. That plans come to naught, or it's just half a page of scribbled lines. I will give a point there. That is very specifically a writer's reference, and we know that Mr. Barrett loved to write. Of course, Mr. Waters also is writing lyrics, as he himself has mentioned, but the extensive nature of Mr. Barrett's writing goes back to his childhood, so that very well could be an influence or a tie to Mr. Barrett. So I'm at 7 points total. Now, in a way, because these poems by John Clare are so well tied into this specific song, I feel I could give more points than I have, but that's all right. We'll just keep going on. The next bit here is quite important, and it's amazing to me how many people don't get this line. Hanging on and quiet desperation is the English way. Okay, I'll give another point for that, and I probably should give two. That is not an English way, of course. Quiet desperation is taken from The Best of Walden, Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. Who is quoting Thoreau? I would like to know. Why are they quoting Thoreau? Thoreau, if you're not familiar with Thoreau, was someone who was very anti-society, who lived and chose to go live a life of solitude in the woods, away from everyone else, to live a life of freedom. Page 15, this is The Best of Walden and Civil Disobedience, Henry David Thoreau, Scholastic, Inc., New York, 1969. I'm on page 15. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. It's astonishing to me that so many people don't recognize that this is a Thoreau reference. There are so many things within Thoreau that are tied specifically to this song and to the feel of this album. Here is a nod to it. I will go through this context element more in the second episode and have a little bit more to say about it there. For now, let's just note that there's another point. So I'm at 8 points now, and that is a very heavy Thoreau reference. And of course, you could choose to tie it in with the previous song about breathe and the later song about money, if you so desire. The next line states that time is gone, song is over, and thought that they had something more to say. Now the next line is that they're home again. So who likes to go home? Mr. Barrett would go home quite frequently. That's 9 points. That they like to be there when they can. They're cold and tired. They like to be warmed by a fire. And then far away across a field, and there's a tolling of an iron bell. So I do wonder if that isn't a reference to the tolling of the bell. Who does the ask not whom the bell tolls for? It tolls for thee. Again, perhaps a reference to religion or to the church, or perhaps a reference to living, life, and death. And then finally, to hear a softly spoken magic spell. Quite a significant amount of alliteration in that last line with the SP, so I will give that 1 more point. And for this song, I have a Syd score of 10, which for us is pretty medium range. I will point out, of course, that these songs are much later from some of the earlier Syd Barrett stuff, so you'll tend to see a divergence in a person's vocabulary over time, so it gets harder and harder to draw correlations. The Great Gig in the Sky I've already discussed. There are no words. It just has to do with Clare Torrey. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about Clare Torrey very specifically is that she had a suit with the band about money. And the reason for that is because, and this was in 2004, and I'll give the referential material here. She basically was given a daily wage for her 1 day of work of £30. I just want to point out how unjustifiable it is that this woman, her voice that really, really is the feel of this and is so spectacular that anyone who listens to this album would point to that singular song and say that is mind-blowing, was paid £30 for that work. And I get it, people are paid whatever they stand in, but the human voice, of course, relays much more than just an instrument. And she really was the focal point of that song. So she really did deserve to get royalties of some sort, in my opinion, for the work that she did on this song. And it's kind of, let's say, a little bit cold that she would have had to go through that and actually go through a suit. Now, this was settled at some point in time. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know for how much, and we probably never will know. I just want to point out that this album is one of the best-selling albums of all time. It made a lot of money, and this woman had to sue to get some of the money, which shows how tight kind of the industry or somebody was really, really tight with their money and didn't want to share it, because the logical thing to do is to say, holy cow, we are raking in the cash on this. Let's make sure we take care of the people that really put it together. Just as an aside, that's my opinion. So let's go through the next song then, Money. First off, of course, money itself is something that Mr. Barrett is quite concerned with. He discusses that in the song Birdie Hop, he just wanted to be making a little bit of money a day. He didn't really want to make a lot of money. So, sorry, just give me just 1 minute here. I think I just closed the window I needed. So let's go ahead and pull it up. Okay. So this, of course, is a bit of an ironic look, or almost like a look at the idea of money as something that is so distasteful that it is almost something repugnant. So I'm going to give this 1 point already because of the title and the nature of the song. So money, you can get away. I mentioned that you should get a good job and good pay, and then you're okay. All very, very simple lyrics, which of course is a way that Mr. Barrett can write at times, but also Mr. Waters has a tendency to write. Money's a gas, so it's a gas. I have heard or read Mr. Barrett specifically use this "it's a gas" term in an interview. If I can find that, I will put it up here. If not, then I'm just going to leave it alone. I'll just point out that I have read or seen an interview somewhere where I believe I saw Mr. Barrett use the term "it's a gas." And of course, "it's a gas" was a very common parlance at the time. Specifically, a statement that you should grab cash with both hands and make a stash. Okay. New car, caviar. Now, if you're familiar with The Wall, you'll recognize this new car caviar as from being referenced in the Wall movie. It is used in that film. That they think they should buy a football team. Money, get back. And then a statement that they're all right, Jack, and keep your hands off of their stack. Money's a hit. Don't give me that goody good bull. So there is again an irreverent reference to the mentality of people that only value money, and the person there is being represented as someone that's greedy and only concerned with the run of life and making money. They're in the high fidelity first class, and they need a Learjet. So very similar to the Bob Dylan blues. And irreverent, look at money. I'll give that one more point. So we're at 2. A statement that the next verse is that money is a crime. You can share it fairly, but don't take any of my money. And so they say that's the root of all evil. So good and evil, right and wrong, these are things, of course, that are religious elements. They're tied to a lot of Mr. Barrett's work. I'll give one more point, so I'm at 3. And finally, the statement that if you ask for a raise, nobody's giving any away. So on this song, I end up with a score of 3. Now, I suspect that's because this song is very, very simple, and it's meant to be simple. But I can't draw a whole lot of correlations to Mr. Barrett. And this is, out of all the songs that I've done so far, this is the song that I am able to draw the least amount of correspondences to Mr. Barrett, with a score of only 3. Now, in the next part, to end this song, there are some quotes, I believe. And throughout the song, or throughout the entire album, I should say, there are numerous people that are being asked questions and responding to them. And I would just like to point out that one of the people that actually showed up and was asked questions was Paul McCartney of the Beatles. And we've already mentioned, of course, that the Beatles and Pink Floyd were recording at Abbey Road at the same time in '67. So why is Paul McCartney recording things for Pink Floyd? He's a big star. Why is he contributing to this album? Is it a favor? Why would there be a favor? Is there some kind of interaction between this band and Paul McCartney, or previously with the Beatles? Is that being continued? Is that happening? I don't know. You can consider that as you wish, but I just want to point out that Mr. McCartney was one of the people that was asked questions, although they ended up not using his voice on this album. Let's look at the next song, titled Us and Them. A wonderful song, and it has a real slow kind of a feel to it, and it's really breaking down the idea of separation of people. And of course, this separation could be what is intended, separation of humanity perhaps into all the different colors of humanity, and all the different variations of experience could be expressed in the prism, the triangular prism on the cover that's symbolically given to represent this album. At any rate, let's go on. It starts off with us and them, and that people are all only ordinary men, or we're all only the same. Me and you. Now, of course, this feels very similar to the song Echoes, which is credited to Mr. Roger Waters, and he specifically, in previous episodes, we discussed his interview where he mentions strangers passing in the street and their separate glances meeting, but they're the same. So the idea that people are separate but still the same is tied up here in this as well. Since that is something that Mr. Waters has covered specifically, I won't give any points for that. Let's continue on. There's a mention that God only knows that it's not what we would choose. You have to wonder if that isn't, that what he would choose to do, but whatever. There's a mention of, in the next line, someone crying from the rear and the front rank died. This all feels very similar to military kind of stories that are tied into The Wall, which is a later album. And the next line is that the front rank died, a general sad, and lines on a map moved from side to side. All totally different from anything Mr. Barrett has ever written, so I can't draw any correlations there whatsoever. In fact, that is very likely tied to the history of Mr. Roger Waters' father, and perhaps not in a, I guess you could say, in an overly positive way. In other words, kind of in a judgmental, negative way of the intentions of whoever this general is in the actual existence in a war. The next line is black and blue. Interesting color choice because, of course, that often is used as a slang term for being bruised or battered. And, of course, the previous bit was about a war, so black and blue. Who knows which is which and who is who. And then there's a mention of things being up and down and round and round. There are certain songs that Mr. Barrett wrote, like Sending a Clock Through a Washing Machine, that seems to be referencing the same idea of things being upside down, but that's so far removed that I can't honestly draw a correlation here. Again, here's Round and Round, and there's a battle of words, and for some reason a poster bearer is crying. There's a man with a gun, and there's room for you inside. What that means, I don't know. The next form of it is, the next verse is that things are down and out, and that there's a lot of it about, and then with and without. So that's pretty extensive alliteration. I'll give one more point. Actually, that's our first point. That's our first point. So 1 point so far. And who'll deny the fighting's about? That someone needs to get out of the way because it's a busy day. There's things on their mind. And for the one of some price in tea and slice, an old man died. The old man, of course, could be a reference to the father. There's mention of a battle. So this very, very likely is very specifically tied to Mr. Waters' life, not to Mr. Barrett's life. I end up with a Syd score of 1. This is the lowest Syd scored song that I've scored so far. And there are references in here that are very, very Roger Waters, tied to the experience of his life. So you would have to think that very likely this is put together by Mr. Roger Waters with very little influence, whatever that may be, of Mr. Barrett. Okay, the next song is Brain Damage, again, lyrically credited to Mr. Roger Waters. So let's take a look at this. Brain Damage right away. That is already an influence of Mr. Barrett because he's the one specifically that was reported to be suffering with forms of, I don't want to say brain damage, but mental illness, etc. Okay, so there's a lunatic on the grass. What is a lunatic? A lunatic, of course, could also be an idiot. This sounds and feels very similar to the idea of a scarecrow, and the scarecrow being in a field. So I'm going to give another point because that is close to the idea that's presented in Scarecrow. What is the Scarecrow doing? He's remembering games and daisy chains and laughs, and you have to keep the loonies on the path. Now, path and laugh are rhymes of sort, I guess you could say. But these are all somewhat new words. I can't remember anyone using the term loony before, but whatever. The next few lines are, a lunatic now is in the hall, and they're in the hall. And there are paper holds their folded faces to the floor. Wow. What a wonderful collection of words there. That is very Syd Barrett. F and L, alliteration, and of course the F and the P. So paper folded faces to the floor, and there's the hold sound. So I'm going to give a point for that. Well, 2 points, so I'm at 4 points. Not just for the alliteration, but also because of the combination of the phonetic sounds P and F, which is something that someone who is a master of language and phonetics would kind of enjoy, the combination of the F and P sound. So let's keep going. Every day the paper boy brings more. I don't know why the paper boy would bring more papers. If the dam is going to break open too soon, many years too soon. So for whom did the dam break many years too soon? Of course, that could very definitely be a Syd Barrett reference. I'll give one more point. I'm at 5. If there's no room upon the hill, why would there be room upon the hill? Well, because there's a fool on the hill. Why is there? That's a Beatles song, the Fool on the Hill. That's an old kind of an idea. I will give one more point for that. The fool has been extensively discussed in our Peeling Syd Barrett series. So that's one more point. I'm at 6. The next line is that your head would explode with dark forebodings too. And then I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. So why would someone's head explode with dark forebodings? Explode with forebodings. Again, there's the F and the P sound with the alliteration on the odings. Explodes, forebodings. I'll give another point. I'm at 7. That shows that someone is quite gifted with words. The next bit states that the lunatic is in their head and that you will raise the blade and make the change and then rearrange me until I'm sane. So I'm going to give that another point because of the reference to people or someone trying to make a person sane, supposedly. And also is voicing almost like a fear that other people are going to try to mess with their mind to make them sane with things like a blade. I just want to point out that there was quite a bit of history in the psychology and psychiatric sciences that have gone back a long time. And of course, there is a history of things like lobotomy that could be referenced here with the blade. I don't want to get into that too much, but that is a possibility. The next few lines mention that you will lock the door and then throw away the key because there's someone in their head, but it's not me. Now, I just want to point out, of course, that this song, if this is Mr. Roger Waters writing this song, why is he referencing himself as a bit of a crazy person, a bit of a loony person? I'm not aware of Mr. Waters behaving or believing that he's a loony in any form or fashion, so I'm a little bit confused. Now, he did mention in some interview that he had a moment where he kind of was, I guess, under a lot of pressure and was going through a breakup, but that was years later. So who at this point in time is going through this very much in line with the experiences perhaps of Mr. Barrett? Mention of a cloud bursting and thunder. Now we've already discussed the idea of clouds, of course. Flaming has the cloud lyric, and thunder, which is from Swan Lee, and the idea of thunder changing your life. And shouting out, but people don't really seem to hear. In other words, people can't seem to understand you. That could very well be another Mr. Barrett reference because people did not seem to be able to understand what he was saying. And I mentioned that if your band is playing different tunes, then they'll see you on the dark side of the moon. At any rate, I end up with 10 on brain damage. Let's get into the last song, Eclipse. And we'll go through that last one. And I don't know necessarily that we're going to be able to make many correlations because this is very, very simple. And it's not going to be easy to tie it with anything. And it does in many ways just kind of tie in back to the very first song of Breathe. where what was the line in Breathe? I'll put it up here, but Breathe kind of ends with this idea of everything is all that your life is going to be. So here, just expanding on that same idea, there's a whole bunch of all that you can do. All you can touch, see, taste, and feel. Love, hate, distrust, and save. All you give, deal, buy, or steal. Beg, borrow, or steal. And everything you create and destroy. Well, I'll give a point for the create and destroy because Mr. Barrett is known to be very creative and to create things, but also to destroy them, which we've discussed in our discussion on the book Grapefruit and Yoko Ono. Everything you say and everything you eat. We know Mr. Barrett had kind of hang-ups about certain types of food that he wouldn't eat, so I'll give a point for that. That's 2. Everyone that you meet and everyone you slight and fight. Everything that's now gone to come. And everything under the sun is in tune, but the sun is eclipsed by the moon. So the idea perhaps that here we are again discussing the nature of things associated with the sun being correct and right. I will get into this a little bit more in our context. I'll give one more point for this. It is a form of philosophical discussion about the differences between being having the sun and things being right and being shaded by an eclipse of the moon. So I end up with a score of 3, which is not very much. And that's pretty much it for a breakdown of the very specific songs on Dark Side of the Moon. So I just have a few questions, I suppose, that I would like to ask, and I'll leave you with these questions. The first is, of course, we already discussed the nature of Miss Tori and the fact that she was not very well paid for the efforts that she made in contributing to this album. So here is my question. On page 400 of Mr. Palacios' book, Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd Dark Globe, he very specifically mentions that 9 May, Mr. Barrett was said to have signed some kind of a document or contract that was affecting his relationship with Pink Floyd. Now, this is somewhere around the 72 to 73 year time frame. Mr. Palacios, unfortunately, does not give a direct year. He does 2 pages previously, I believe, specifically call out that in 17 through 20 February, Pink Floyd was already introducing Dark Side of the Moon. So, if that is the case, then Dark Side of the Moon was, of course, released in 73. It was released in March of 73. And this is 2 pages later. So if it's chronologically ordered, this would mean that after, in May of 73, there was some form of change to the relationship between Mr. Barrett and Pink Floyd contractually. Why? Why would that happen then? What does that mean? Well, we discussed this quite a bit in Peeling Syd Barrett, chapter 24. And I will go back to Peeling Syd Barrett, chapter 24, one last time. Now, at that time, I did not have a very thorough understanding of a number of nuanced topics with Mr. Barrett and Pink Floyd. But retrospectively now, I feel a little bit stronger in the connection to be made. Now, the idea of chapter 24 is the Foo hexagram. We've already discussed the Foo hexagram, and essentially it consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. So, according to this mentions that the first 9, which is not broken, shows a subject returning from some form of an error with no great extent, and there is good fortune. So that's 1 return. The second 6 shows the admirable return. So that's a second return. The third 6 shows a repeated return. The fourth 6, moving right in the center and yet returning alone to his proper path. And so the fifth 6 shows that there is a noble return. So this fifth is a fifth return, and it is noble, and things go well. And then finally, the last 6 is broken and is a returning full of calamities. So I want to look real quick at these albums again. And if you are of the mindset that perhaps Mr. Barrett may have been contributing to these albums in some way, I will use chapter 24 and this theory of 5 returns, which would possibly mean 5 working together with the band under some kind of an agreement. And of course, he was still under contract with EMI, and this would possibly explain why he was having Mr. Waters and Mr. Gilmore help him on his own albums. Perhaps they were still contractually obligated to help one another. So let's look at the albums. After Piper at the Gates of Dawn is an album, Saucer Full of Secrets. Now, Mr. Barrett already had a song that was kind of recorded, Jug Band Blues, that's tied to that album, but nothing else really overly too much that seems to be driven by him. And the album itself is not a coherent album. It is a collection of some good songs, but it is not a coherently tied concept album. The next album is More in '69. That is a coherent tied album. I'll put a star next to that one as possibly being influenced by Mr. Barrett. Amagama is next. Again, not a coherent album. In fact, it has very specific things that you can point to that are developed by each member of the band. And each one of them is showcasing their particular skills and talents, very unlikely to be contributed to by Mr. Barrett other than, I believe, one song, Grantchester Meadows, which we've gone through that already. The next album, Atom Heart Mother, is very much a concept album, and we went through that discussion. So that's 2 returns possible. The next is Metal, very much a concept album again. The idea of memories and perhaps the submarine nature of floating through life and life of memories. And we discussed that in our Did Syd Barrett Metal. We have not discussed Obscured, but it is very much a concept album, so I'll do one more point for that. And there's a reason I'm not doing Obscured by Clouds. And that's because it is so similar to More that I don't believe that it's actually worth talking about. But if you're keeping track now, that's 4 albums. Now the fifth return, as noted by chapter 24, is to be an honorable and very positive return. And in this case, that would be this particular album, Dark Side of the Moon. Is this a coherent album? Yes, it is. Is it possibly an album that may have been influenced by Mr. Barrett, or perhaps was it something that he was directly contributing to? I don't know, but it has a mark of genius. And based on the fact that you have 5 albums that appear to be coherent theme albums, and this is the 5th one of them, it is interesting to me that it ties in very nicely with chapter 24 of Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, the next return, of course, would be one that is based on chapter 24, a return of failure. And that is exactly what happens with the Wish You Were Here album. So that's pretty much it for my thoughts on this album, and specifically the lyrics and possible contributions of Mr. Barrett. The next episode, I'm going to tear apart Mr. Blake, I'm going to tear apart Mr. Thoreau, and I'm going to tear apart John Clare. And I will give you some more background of those people and some possible influences on this album. Then I will specifically be discussing Dark Side of Oz, and then we'll finish up with a discussion on Dune. Well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and it was worthwhile, and at the very least gave you things to think about. There are a lot of people, of course, that will not believe that in any way Mr. Barrett, I suppose, had any contribution to the lyrics, and they will very much believe that Mr. Waters single-handedly wrote all this and put all this material together, and he does seem to be a fairly intelligent man, so I'm not going to say that that isn't possible. I just want to point out that there are some influences here that do guide me towards Mr. Barrett, and I think it's worthwhile to discuss them and consider them. And I do find it interesting that so many of these particularly literary references that are very, I guess you could say, obscure, are kind of coming into the lyric set here of this album. That would, in my mind, very much be something that Mr. Barrett would do. At any rate, that's it. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'll suggest that you please subscribe and give a share and a like. And don't forget notifications. Notifications help if I put out new stuff. It helps you kind of be aware that new things have come out. So that's it for now. I'll talk to you later.